On Press Perspective today, we shed light on South Korea's health insurance service, as well as a growing campaign among cafes in the country against squatters. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome. It's Friday, August 29th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. Now, today we touch upon a number of social stories related to South Korea in the foreign media. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post. Live on the line, Kelly, it's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me again.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us with the pundit's take here in the studio. Colin, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Kelly, we will start with you. Let's begin with a recent article by you for the Washington Post. You covered the burden of U.S. healthcare costs, forcing some Americans to move to other countries, including South Korea. Could you walk us through your story?
Yeah, so this is a story that I spent more than a year reporting, and I spoke to at least 24 people for this piece. And what I was looking at is this largely unstudied phenomenon of, a small group of Americans permanently, so emigrating out of the United States to live in another country, with their main reason being concerns about U.S. healthcare costs. And so I spoke with people who had relocated to Europe, to South Korea, to Japan, to Mexico, and parts of South America, all sorts of countries. And why is this happening? Well, for those who are not in the United States, the U.S. has one of the most expensive healthcare systems. Actually, it is the most expensive healthcare system in the world. Americans pay more for healthcare out of any other country that is studied in the world. And the medical bills are exorbitantly high, and not everyone has health insurance. So, for instance, one of the people that I interviewed that is featured in the piece focuses on just 3 of the 20-something people that I spoke with. He called 911 because he was experiencing symptoms. He was encouraged to take an ambulance to the hospital. It turned out that he had a minor bacterial infection that honestly only needed to be treated with an ointment. But because he did not have health insurance, because he didn't have an employer who provided it to him, and he couldn't afford a private plan, he was billed $50,000 US for that one visit. He eventually applied to get it waived, and it was able to be waived, but this is largely because he was in New York City, which has one of the most progressive healthcare policies for people who are low income in the world. And this person is of Korean heritage. That experience really burned him, made him afraid to see a doctor, and years later he ended up moving to South Korea, largely because he was concerned about his healthcare costs, and he was delaying treatment for some conditions until he could get here. Because I'm speaking to an audience that's largely focused on Korea, there's been a lot of attention on the healthcare system here. I think when you look at the United States, you really see a healthcare system where people are kind of left on their own to figure it out. And by no coincidence, the United States, your average American lives far less than a Korean person. So you're talking about years off of their lifespan. And one of the factors of that is the lack of access to affordable health care.
Right. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the $50,000 US bill just to take an ambulance to a hospital for a minor bacterial infection. This is in the absence, of course, of an insurance policy in New York City. Right, that being said, Colin, as a long-term resident here in South Korea who is registered with the country's mandatory health insurance, what can you tell us about this policy?
Well, I didn't move to Korea from the U.S. in order to take advantage of the healthcare system, but I have used it, as we all have, and my experience has been, I would say, very good. I haven't had any major procedures myself or anything like that, but from what I've experienced and what I've seen, it is more straightforward. And there is the cost difference, of course. Everything here seems so cheap to me, coming from the U.S. or not just cheap, not just in terms of price, but availability, accessibility. In Korea, you can see a specialist directly. You can just find any specialist you want to see, even in your neighborhood, and just walk right in, usually on the day, see them, which is unthinkable in the US, where you see your primary care physician, then maybe they'll deign to give you a referral to this specialist as long as they're in your network, maybe they're not. Those complications are gone here. It's much simpler. And part of that has to do with the fact that insurance is marshaled through one national organization, one national body. And this was instituted, I believe, in the year 2000. And South Korea, as a smaller country and a densely populated one, typically so that society can change very quickly. Structures can change, institutions can change, and society follows suit quicker than it would in a country like the United States, which maybe you can't do these kind of reforms at all, or on a reasonably short timeline. But there are many advantages here, one of them being I want to say the word is biannually or biennially. Every 2 years, you get the health checkup. And that's not mandatory, but it's the kind of service you don't see in the US as well, where you can go to a hospital that specializes in these things. In these checkups, you go from station to station within the hospital, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you're done, you get the results, and you come back 2 years after that. Maybe that is one reason for the sort of longer lifespans and better health outcomes in general in the US, in Korea than in the US. But there are downsides, which we'll get to. The system does have some financial problems, but from the perspective of the user, it's much less complex than in the US, much less fragmented, of course. And I think if nobody enjoys using a medical system, but it is less painful in many ways than in the US.
Right. Kelly, Colin touched upon this. There have been some concerns about the abuse of Korea's health insurance service, especially amid its fiscal uncertainty. What are these concerns and what were your takeaways?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you speak about healthcare systems around the world, especially nationalized or socialized healthcare and medicine, there is often this narrative that is forwarded, speaking to my article that I wrote for the Washington Post, that people are coming into countries and, spending the country's resources to get this good health care. And I just want to point out as a preface that, if someone were to come to South Korea, they would have to get some kind of visa status here, and they would be paying for their national health insurance. Part of their tax dollars go to the national health insurance system again. So there is no taking advantage of the system, so to speak. The system in South Korea is built in a way where those who make more pay more, in theory, to subsidize the healthcare of people who make less. And so, the interesting thing with South Korea's national healthcare system, which I think is quite functional and, aspirational, at least as an American, is that, as South Korea deals with the population crisis, this is another pillar of Korean society that is struggling, because you have a system where it's a terribly aging population. There are very few babies being born every year. There's widespread youth unemployment. And so what's happening is you have a lot of older people who are no longer able to work or find jobs if they even wanted to, right? And so they need a lot of health care, as we all do as we age. And part of that health care is subsidized by the government. Part of it is subsidized by the whole populace that's paying into the system. But if you have fewer younger, middle-aged working people, you have less tax dollars and premium dollars from the health insurance plans going into the system, right? And on the trajectory that South Korea is, where very few babies are being born, 20 or 30 years down the line, there's a question of how the system is going to be sustainable. And this is something that you see in a lot of super aged populations, such as Italy. So, South Korea's health insurance system does face some fiscal uncertainty when you're talking about a couple of decades down the line, but this is a problem that is, affecting all parts of society. You see universities in South Korea closing. You see elementary schools closing. You see not enough men in the military to protect the country against the North Korea security threat. But all in all, countries that have healthcare systems like South Korea, where people are able to share the costs and everyone gets access to care and coverage, that is something that we do not have in the United States. And I think more and more Americans are calling for that.
Right. With regard to the population decline here in the country, Colin, though there has been an uptick in Korea's birth rate, and it has reportedly been going up for the past 12 months in a row with regard to on-year rises, of course. Now, you, I believe, have done your part to contribute to this rise as a father of two twins who were born earlier this month. What have been some of your first-hand experiences with regard to national efforts to boost the birth rate, Colin?
Yes, we're all out there doing our part, or more and more of us are anyway. Although I should say, it wasn't part of my thinking that I have to raise Korea's birth rate necessarily, and it wasn't also, I mean, it wasn't a huge factor that Korea gives out money and other benefits, although that is well known by now, well known within Korea, of course, and Asia, but also it's being increasingly covered in the foreign media that Korea pays you to have babies. And the money is not nothing. I mean, it is a considerable amount, and the current president, the new president, Lee Jae-myung, has proposed raising the amount of money, raising the benefits, giving more to prospective parents or to new parents. And well, of course, the other candidate said the same thing. But yes, this is a matter of concern enough that every politician has to say something about it, has to provide a proposal. But yes, you do get some benefits depending on your citizenship status, the status of your husband or wife with whom you're having the baby, and all that. So I often say to, especially foreigners considering this, check what you're eligible for. Because it might not be everything. There might be some things you do get, some benefits you do get as a foreigner that you don't get as a couple of two Koreans. So look into it. I mean, do your homework, but it's nice to have. And I couldn't help but notice as well that around the time my wife and I were sort of figuring out how to have a family, I saw more ads, more PSAs, public service announcements, more campaigns meant to promote a raising of the birth rate, meant to promote starting families, having children. And so while it doesn't feel like these campaigns made me more inclined to become a father, they probably didn't hurt either. Although I think more than anything else, more than the financial incentives, more than the PSAs, all these campaigns, people in Korea, Koreans are feeling this a little more than they did. They're feeling the low birth rate more than they did. 10 years ago when I got here, these discussions were happening. People would talk about like, oh, the birth rate's not looking good, not a lot of babies anymore, the society's aging, but it was abstract at that time in the mid-2010s. And now, as Kelly mentioned, you see schools close. You see this on the street, even in Seoul, or you'll see yuchiwon, kindergarten, I guess you'd say, places like that closed, child care centers closed or at a lower capacity. Just the infrastructure of childhood has been getting winnowed, and you can see it. And so I think people now feel a little more, they feel an incentive to start a family sooner than they would have otherwise, because they can sense what's coming in a visceral or a palpable way that they couldn't before. And of course, Korea, apart from government programs, has facilities like the Sanhu Choriwon, or the postpartum care centers, which I've been staying at for the past 2 weeks with my wife, and that eases the transition. You get to go to a hotel-like facility where they take care of your babies most of the day, and you can sort of learn to look after them, which in the US, you don't get at all. It's from the hospital straight to home, and do your best to figure it out. And that, to me, was not an appealing prospect when I lived there, I will say.
Right. And staying with newborns, Kelly, findings for last year show births out of wedlock hit almost 6% of the total number of newborns here in South Korea. Could you tell us more about the implications of this finding, for South Korea that is, and how does this compare with the reality in other countries perhaps?
Well, 6% of children being born outside of a legal marriage is a rise for South Korea, but it's worth noting that it's one of the lowest rates in the world. Japan and Turkey also being among countries that see the lowest rates. What does it suggest? It might suggest that more and more women feel less stigma, family planning, or raising children outside of marriage. Generally speaking, social research in Korea shows that there's a high association between marriage and childbirth. So most Korean people historically have felt that marriage is a prerequisite to having a child with someone. And it seems in this case that is changing a little. But I would say, generally speaking, South Korea, as we've been discussing, is not having a lot of newborns. And of the small, fraction of the population that is pregnant and giving birth, we're talking about a very small portion of that choosing or, opting to have children outside of wedlock. Whether or not these are unexpected pregnancies or it's just a matter of the wedding being delayed, who knows? Certainly weddings in South Korea have gotten more and more expensive. And, the country has been growing much slower economically in recent years. And so it could just be that people don't feel that signing marriage papers or having a ceremony is as important as, raising a child. It's hard to say, but I do think, South Korea has always been a country that surprises me in terms of how quickly it can experience social change. And this would be an indicator that maybe some of, the preconceived notions about what is necessary to have a family is shifting ever so slightly.
You're right. I suppose time will tell us then. Kelly, I'd like to move on to another topic now. Making foreign headlines this particular month is a campaign here in South Korea within cafes, where these cafes are seeking to fight squatters. I mentioned this in a small clip at the start of our talk. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so there's a word in Korean, it's like Cagongjok, which is like Koreans love breaking up words into one syllable and combining them together. So this is like cafe, study, and family kind of all combined into one word. And so it would suggest that there's like a clan of people that use cafes for studying or for working remotely. And it's become a little bit of an internet subculture, if you will, but it's also become a real problem because, businesses in South Korea, so the amount of investment it usually takes to open a brick and mortar store or a cafe in South Korea is far less than, say, the United States on average. But with that, it's a highly competitive business society. The cafe culture here is quite expansive. And so you see a lot of businesses opening and closing, and the rents are also incredibly high. So for those who take out loans or use their money to open a cafe business, not only are they competing with, a gazillion other cafes in their area, but they really need that foot traffic to keep moving. So they need to do a lot of takeout, they need to do a lot of delivery, and they need, people changing seats every so hours. So the idea of having someone inside of your cafe spending, like, let's say $3 to $5 on a coffee and staying there for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, especially if you have a smaller space, that has become somewhat controversial, which is why we're calling them squatters, right? But this issue, exists, I think, anywhere in the world. I've been to all sorts of countries where cafes make a point that they don't allow laptops or they don't allow Wi-Fi, people to connect to the Wi-Fi, because they don't want these cafe squatters, if you will. And I even read online, I've actually never seen this, thank goodness, but I even read online that some people, they try to work remotely full time from cafes, which is fairly normal, but that they, will bring 2 monitors and like a standing desk extension and try to set up in a cafe every day. So I think what we're seeing is kind of a little bit, we love the cafe culture here in Korea, but there's maybe a misunderstanding of what good etiquette is as a customer if you're spending just a few dollars and taking up a table for half a day.
Right, a picture online, Kelly, actually showed computers and a photocopy machine as well at one coffee place. Right, Colin,
That's great.
The BBC links this phenomenon to the competitive academic environment here in the country and essentially to a lack of living space. What are your thoughts?
These are tempting points to draw lines between in Korean society. You hear so much in the Western media about Korean study culture. And this BBC article writes about a cafe in Daechidong, which is the red-hot center of study culture. You couldn't find a more apt place to write this piece, but it's not necessarily representative of the rest of Seoul, to say nothing of Korea. And yes, kids have to study a lot. And homes are smaller than they are in the US, certainly. I don't know, probably a little bit smaller than in England as well. They're usually apartments. In any case, they're not unlivably small for the most part, and some are quite spacious to my mind. And kids usually have their own study rooms, or at least study corners of their bedrooms. So they could study at home. But I do get the sense culturally, people just do certain things. They live certain parts of their lives in public more than in the US. I do most of my writing in cafes. I did that in the US as well. But when I came here, I just brought that habit over with me. And Korea, more than any other country I've been to, the cafes are by far more geared toward that. I mean, they provide outlets, they provide spaces. They're almost inviting you to do that for the most part. Certain very small specialized cafes can be different, but Starbucks is hugely popular in Korea. Seoul is the most Starbucks-having city per capita of them all in the world. And this campaign Starbucks has supposedly launched into about keeping out the squatters. Yes, it is about outlandish behaviors like bringing not just a laptop, a desktop computer, a printer, a power strip, setting up an office in the cafe, which I've never quite seen anything that bad. You do see some behaviors that are questionable, but not that often. And you see behaviors that are not in Korea questionable, but in the US wouldn't happen, such as in the Starbucks here near Arirang. I was there a few weeks ago, and I saw a young lady studying for her English exam, and then she just put her head down on her textbook and fell asleep for 2 hours. You would not do that in the US, partially because it's illegal in most places, but just nobody would feel that safe, I think, just sleeping in a cafe in public. And it's been much said in this BBC article as well. Some people set up their computer, they step out for an hour or 2 hours, and they come back later, and that's annoying, I can understand, to the cafe owner, but at the same time, you wouldn't do it in the US. You'd assume everything would be gone when you got back. So in a way, it says some good things about Korean society, even if the behaviors themselves are not that good. But I was at the Starbucks here next to Arirang, almost next to Arirang, for about 4 hours before coming on this broadcast today. And nobody sort of made the move to kick me out, and nobody brought their own monitors. I think everything was sort of going as normal. So I think this might be a slightly exaggerated story, but it tells you something true about Korean society.
Right, and can I correct myself? I believe it was a printer, not a photocopy machine.
Yeah, well, both pretty ridiculous, I would say.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time. Right, Colin, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Kelly, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this week's editions of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.